Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this session. Let's welcome Rafe Britton from Technical Specialist at Lubrication Expert as he shares his knowledge on what does the future of the industry look like. Rafe, I pass it over to you.
All right, thanks, Arturo. All right, good day, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session of LRVS, and hopefully you've had a really good session so far. I've only just woken up in Sydney, so you'll have to excuse me. But I hear that the sessions so far have been fantastic. So um, hopefully this lives up to the expectations. Now, I'm going to be talking through a little bit of kind of like the future of the industry. So in terms of like the future of the industry, specifically, we'll talk about the future of industrial lubricants, right? So the industry obviously is all encompassing, including, base oil and additive supply chains and, engine oils and things like that. I think the LRVS audience would benefit from focusing just on industrial lubricants. Now, the first and kind of most obvious question is what makes me qualified to really talk about the future of the industry? And to be honest, there's no specific domain knowledge that I have that makes me qualified for this. But for those who don't know, I have a YouTube channel called Lubrication Explained with a accompanying podcast called Lubrication Experts, where I get to talk to people who actually know what they're talking about, right? Now, one thing that you'll notice, everyone on the left is kind of an LRVS alumnus, right? And some of whom are featuring again today. So there's, I think, almost 50 episodes up until this point, and it gives me an opportunity to really talk to people who are actually at the cutting edge and doing some really interesting work, whether it's in the field of actual lubricant formulations, additives, degradation mechanisms, sensors, all of that kind of stuff. And there's some really, really thoughtful people doing some amazing work out there. And really all I'm doing is kind of collating their experiences and trying to project out what I think the industry looks like based on what I hear in the industry. So I'm going to kind of consolidate this into three separate trends that I think everyone likes lists of three. And so the first one is going to be the idea of the consolidation of knowledge. And this is something that I'm seeing everywhere. This is certainly a trend which you could probably ascribe not just to our industry, but to others as well. I just think it's a little bit more acute in our industry. And there's this idea that the industry's golden generation is retiring really quickly. So if you look at the guys that I term the Noria Mafia, right? So if anyone's heard the term the PayPal Mafia, which is, Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and David Sachs, they all went on to found influential companies in the Silicon Valley kind of tech industry. A similar kind of thing seemed to spin out of Noria, where you had the likes of, Jim Fitch and Mike Johnson and Mike Ramsey and Drew Troyer. And a lot of these, early guys that worked at Noria then went on to either found their own companies or become very influential in the field. And a lot of the guys of their ilk, even though, they're very robust and certainly have a few more years in them, there's this generation of people that are, approaching retirement age. And one of the things that we have to do is figure out, how to transfer their knowledge, first of all, so that it's not lost and so that we retain that institutional knowledge. But also, how do we attract some younger people into this specific engineering discipline? I've talked about this a few times, but we face a few challenges here where there is the perception. At LRVS, we all know that this is not true, but there is the perception of our attachment to the oil industry, and that carries baggage with it. And so there's a lot of people in younger generations who have no desire to be involved with that. And so we have to overcome that sort of perceptual difference. But on top of that, I think there's a real opportunity for us to show how interesting our field is and how many fields it touches and its actual impact on sustainability, which we all, fully understand, but I think is not maybe appreciated by a lot of people out there. So that's one thing. One thing you'll also find is that within lubricant companies, within lubricant marketers and manufacturers, this same phenomenon is actually occurring as well. You'll often go into some slightly smaller, kind of mid-tier lubricant marketers, and what you'll find is that they have a guy, right? That person fits a profile. They're usually approaching 70 years of age, It's usually an older man who has been at the company for 40 to 45 years. He knows where all the bodies are buried and he understands all the formulations. But most of these businesses have not had either the wherewithal or the foresight to or the capacity to be able to train someone up to replace that person. And so that's a real kind of pressing need. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to train people at scale, which I think is going to mean more events and more online learning. So obviously, Fluidtech's seen this with and has the LRVS platform. I've got my own one, Lubrication Explained Pro. I think all of that's going to be necessary. Now, it doesn't replace in-person learning. I think in-person learning is always going to be more effective, but in order to train a lot of people at scale, we're going to need online learning. And the other thing that we'll probably need is a lot more events like this, where there's an opportunity to cross-pollinate knowledge from different people in the industry. There's a little bit of kind of event fatigue, I think, setting in because there are a lot of industry events now. But the reality is that a lot of maintenance and reliability teams, they just don't have the sort of scale to facilitate knowledge transfer within their organization. And so they need to look to external events like this to be able to develop their personnel. All right, so that brings me to very quickly to trend number 2, which kind of links to trend number 1, which is this idea of sustainable lubrication. And one of the reasons this is so important is, number 1, we all want to be sustainable. That's a motivating factor. Number 2, I think it's going to be essential for recruitment. So like I talked about before, there is a golden generation that's retiring. We need people to replace them. And being shown to be part of the solution to the world's sustainability issues is going to be a key part of that sort of recruitment drive. Finally, not finally, thirdly, we've got regulation pressures, right? That's almost inevitable. And you certainly see the EU leading with it, but the Americas and certain parts of America, usually you think of California as leading that charge as well. So regulatory pressure is going to come to bear on our industry. And finally, I think it's just going to become inevitable that as the fossil fuel industry at some stage, right, whether it's tomorrow or 40 years down the track, is going to have to find alternatives. And so sustainable lubrication is all part of that. Now, sustainable lubrication, I kind of bucket into 4 different, broad areas. And one being, how do we make the most of the lubricants we have? So doing drain extension. How do we look to alternate, non-crude sources? So bio-based lube oils. How do we then create a circular economy or a circular value chain around lubricants? And then how do we use energy efficient oils? And when you add all of those 4 together, then we kind of can achieve sustainable lubrication. So briefly, just to talk about drain extension, I see a few things here. One, in the condition monitoring space, looking at improved criteria for oil drains. So, a lot of the work that I do with end users, the criteria for draining your oil is a holdover from 50 years ago. There's still gas engine customers, for example, who are using TAN TBN crossover as their primary method for draining oils. And I think there's an opportunity to get a little bit more precise and a little bit more refined about how we do some of these things. Usually that results in drain extensions. Obviously, filtration of lubricants is going to become super important, and there's new filtration technologies out there that I think a lot of businesses are not leveraging right now. So we know, for example, things like resin media filtration, even depth media filtration. If we're cooling the oil to sort of remove varnish, all of these things are not necessarily explored and are not necessarily mainstream. And the reconditioning of lubricants, which I'll talk about in a bit. Then we've got the bio-based lubricants. There's a handful of startups which are working on this. So either looking at how do we take, seed oils or vegetable-derived oils or palm-derived oils and create sort of these ester-based lubricants. There's also a whole family of ester-based derivatives and hybrids. So if you look at companies like Biosynthetic Technologies with their Esterlides or V-Base, who have these kind of hybrid esters, these are products which overcome some of the well-known Achilles heels of esters, where, say, for example, we know that esters are susceptible to hydrolysis, so the interaction with water causes them to fall apart. some of these businesses have found ways of developing the molecule such that it doesn't suffer from those weaknesses. And the other thing I see is EAL is becoming a lot more important as people become a lot more aware of the potential impacts of lubricants when they are spilt, obviously not on purpose, but accidental releases into the environment. How can we mitigate that? Obviously, we do everything we can to prevent the release, but if it does happen, then the likes of biodegradable or environmentally acceptable lubricants can help then mitigate the effects. So that's what I kind of see in the bio-based lubricant space, and there's a lot of innovation that's going on at the moment, which is really kind of encouraging. This is not your grandfather's ester, is how you might talk about it. Now, from a sustainability perspective, we need to still look at the supply chains and ensure that they're sustainable. Palm oil plantations can be problematic in terms of monocultures and removal of rainforest, but I think there are certainly ways that we can resolve this. Then you've got the recycled lubricants. Now, these kind of come with a little bit of stigma, so to speak. There's the term, recycled oils, but realistically, what we need to see is more capture on the back end of end users. How do we capture a little bit more volume? How do we segregate that volume so it is easier to recycle? And what kind of technologies can we develop? Now, this is actually, I would say, a relatively kind of nascent space where there's a lot of innovation again. There's opportunities for cross-pollination between a lot of the recycling facilities across the world that don't necessarily share common technologies. So my understanding, having talked to a few industry insiders, is that they're trying to organize actually a conference of all these recyclers next year, which would be a great opportunity for all of them to learn a little bit more about best practices. Because, I think recycling has to be part of the solution, right? Creating that circular economy. And ultimately, what that kind of leads to is, can we do it on site? The likes of SKF's Recondo project, for example, come to mind, where how can we do filtration on site and then re-additize the product and create like a small circular economy on site? Alternatively, for businesses that can't justify that kind of capex, how do we send out our used lubricants, but bring them back in sort of that sort of cyclical process? All right, and then the final aspect of it is the use of energy efficient oils. Now, most of us here who are present at this talk, we understand the value that lubricants can bring to energy efficiency, but it's not necessarily that widely accepted. Many people are not aware of the differences between, let's say, minerals and synthetics. But this is a trend that obviously we're seeing. I think it's most visible in the engine oil industry, where we're seeing much lower viscosity lubricants. So the use of, the fact that SAE 0W8 exists is almost inconceivable to anyone that was in the industry 20 years ago. But the idea of using synthetics, alternative base oils that are low traction, like PAGs, that's certainly something that will be looked at, and even these sort of film forming additives, which I'll talk about in a second. So there's a lot of innovation in the additive space, which I think it has a lot of potential. So that's kind of the four major themes that I see in sustainable lubrication, which will kind of drive what the development of the future looks like for our industry. Trend number 3 I see as being kind of custom lubrication solutions. And what do I mean by that? Let's look at, for example, the options for formulation solutions for varnish. And I have to give Fluidtech a lot of credit for bringing this kind of into the mainstream. So, once upon a time, I think if you even asked maybe the question 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, the idea of a lot of operators for putting in a non-OEM approved additive that could extend their oil drains would have very much been, I'm not going to touch that. There was a lot of hesitancy around that, a lot of questions about, have you tested compatibility with my specific lubricant in my specific scenario? And unless the OEM has approved this, we're not going anywhere near it. That sentiment has changed over time as people have seen the success of, let's say, well-formulated drop-in additives. So the number on the top right that's just a straw poll of some of my customers. I think I asked about 20 of them. I said, would you consider drop-in solutions, even if they weren't OEM approved? And I was actually surprised at the response rate. About 65%, so I think it was 13 out of 20, said that they would actually consider it even without OEM approval. And I think that's reflective of a change where people are understanding a little bit more about how we can treat our lubricants over the long term to ensure that they last longer. So when you look at the solutions we have for varnish, I think, combinations of base oil or alcohol-based, solvency enhancers are becoming a little bit more widely accepted. Now, obviously, there is a range of performance that's available. Just throwing in a diester and hoping for the best is no longer acceptable. We have to come up with high-quality solutions. The other thing that's being looked at as well is, as ESD becomes a little bit more prevalent, we know that we have solutions on the filtration side, making filters out of specific materials, but there's conductivity enhancers that's starting to show up in the market as well. And people are building that into their formulations and saying, well, how can I formulate a lubricant so that it has some conductivity to it, which can then prevent ESD from forming as well. One other thing that is starting to be looked at a little bit more, nanoparticles for friction reduction. Now, there's a lot of noise around this. Sometimes it's all marketing hype without any teeth behind it. So, as an example, we all heard about graphene a couple of years ago, and graphene was going to be in everything. Well, then after the marketing hype dies down a bit, then, the actual scientific research and development has to go into, well, how does this look in a product? One thing I'll say about graphene as being a really good example for nano additives is that there was an institute in Singapore that evaluated most of the graphene that's available on the market and determined that most of it was not graphene. It was actually graphite. So it's kind of a bit of a buyer beware, right? And there's a lot of work that has to go into actually determining that the product that you have bought is real graphene. So I think these additives kind of get tarnished with a bad reputation for being, all hype with no science behind them. Not only that, but they're not accepted by a lot of OEMs. They tend to be very expensive on a per kilo basis, and on top of that, I think there are concerns about regulatory pressure. So, what does the EU REACH legislation look like for nano additives, for example? Because I know there are concerns on the engine oil side, for example, about what happens when these nano additives make their way into the exhaust and people start breathing them in. What's the effect on human health? So there are a lot of concerns over that. However, even despite those concerns, the sort of the benefits to some of these friction reducing additives from a sustainability standpoint are probably going to start commanding a bit of attention. So I've seen a lot of work, for example, including some of these powders in greases to really good effect. So we get energy savings from creating some kind of like low friction layer on surfaces. And there's also a certain amount of wear reduction that goes on with that. So if you can reduce the amount of energy that's actually in the load zones, then that obviously has a beneficial effect on reducing the amount of micropitting that occurs. So that starts to become very important when we're talking about, gears and bearings. So I think the opportunity is certainly there to be able to drive some change. So that overall is kind of the picture as I see it. Like I said, there's three broad categories of change that I see. One being more workforce related, and how do we retain that knowledge? So that would be absolutely number one, and it's probably the priority, to be honest, because the people that I term the golden generation are basically starting to retire. So a lot of the work that I've been picking up, frankly, over the last 12 months is people in that generation retiring and passing their business to me, because there's not that many people in Australia. It's a pretty small industry. But I suspect that is going to happen across the world as well, as the baby boomers, who are quite a large generation, start to hand things down to us. So that's one thing, to ensure that knowledge is retained by the industry and isn't lost, because we don't want to take a step back. Second of all, sustainable lubrication. So I'd like to talk about, there was 4 different elements to that. How do we kind of put our foot forward as an industry to show that we are part of the solution to climate change? And finally, looking at a whole range of solutions for things like drop-in additives and nano additives, that sort of like custom formulation route where we can go to a customer and prescribe a chemical solution, for want of a better word, that probably goes along with some kind of filtration. To me, that's kind of like the next era when it comes to maintenance and reliability solutions, specifically for the lubricants. So that's the 3 broad trends that I see. Really appreciate everyone coming along, and I'm happy to open it up to some of the Q&A.
Rafe, thank you very much for the great session. We have a couple of questions here. We have a few minutes to take them. Let me read them out, and maybe you could answer them.
Cool.
First question is from Vanda Franco, and it's hello, Rafe. The golden generation that is retiring fast and with large knowledge and experience does have most of the available certifications that we can have access nowadays. Do you believe that the new generation must have all the certifications to be better, professional, and considered an expert?
Good question. Okay, so I don't think it's necessary, and the only reason I say that is because whenever you hear these questions, there's always edge cases, right? So one of the most intelligent people I know in the industry is an old friend from Mobil, Mike Blumenfeld, who's basically now the lead formulator at ExxonMobil. He doesn't have any of these certifications as far as I'm aware, but he's one of the most intelligent people and most well-accomplished people in the industry. Having said that, I do think that certification, whether it's through ICML or STLE, are both really good foundational pathways for building some of that institutional knowledge that we need. So, the ICML and STLE syllabuses that they prescribe for the MLA, MLT, and CLS programs are kind of like tried and tested ways to develop that knowledge base. So while I don't necessarily think that the certification, that kind of stamp of approval, is absolutely essential to being a good lubrication engineer, I think it's kind of a pathway that has been developed by that golden generation to say, if we were in your position, here's the knowledge that we would want you to have in order to be most effective in the industry. So that's kind of how I look at certification. To me, in some respects, the syllabus is more important than the certificate, but the certificate is that external show that you have understood the syllabus well and can put it into action.
Excellent question, Vanda, and thank you very much for the detailed answer, Rafe. We have another question. Greg Livingstone. Brilliant presentation, Rafe. You didn't mention some of the trendy terms in our industry, such as AI, IIoT, or sensors. Do you see these technologies having an impact on our industry?
Yeah, definitely. Good point. Thanks for the question, Greg. Some of these catch-all terms. So definitely, that is. Look, AI seems like it's going to have an impact on everyone. I'd say for the people at LRVS, where I see the impact of AI being felt most acutely is probably in the field as it relates to interpretation of, maintenance and reliability data streams. So that's maybe not necessarily something that we see on the lubricant side as it is on the maintenance and reliability side. To me, that kind of feels a bit more like a field application. There's certainly going to be some niches where, let's say, some formulation chemistry might be taken over by AI as well. But I don't think a lot of our industry in lubricants is going to see a lot of that development work. And that's kind of why I didn't talk about it too much. I think for our industry at least, it's maybe not going to touch as many people. Obviously, day to day, people will make use of AI tools and that kind of thing to make themselves more efficient. And yeah, but I don't necessarily see it having a huge impact on us necessarily. Now, the other one was about like Internet of Things and sensors and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, absolutely. I do see that. That's probably something still, I don't know, to me, it seems like 10 to 15 years out in that at the moment, everyone still is quite comfortable with the traditional ways of doing oil analysis, as in either taking samples and testing them in the field with some, relatively rudimentary kind of field testing, or sending it off to the lab and getting those regular results. And the reason I say that the shift to sensors might be a little bit slower is just because, well, my experience anyway with a lot of customers is that they're still not doing that very basic level of oil analysis correctly. And so for them to make the jump to sensors and actually get the value out of that, I think is another leap. I do think it's kind of inevitable, right? People are going to want to see, real time. And as the sensors develop and get a lot better, I do think there's a lot of value in that. So yeah, maybe the next edition of my talk, I'll have to include that as a separate topic.
Great. Thank you. We have another 4 minutes. If anyone else has any additional questions to ask, please do so now. And we'll go from there. Let's see.
As we give people a little bit more time, I guess the general comment would be that the future is very bright for this industry. There is a lot of research and development that's going on. There's a lot of innovation. And so when people kind of get a bit, people at industry conferences tend to get a little bit down because they see the future projections of volumes in our industry radically decreasing because of engine oils basically going away with the introduction of electric vehicles. And that's certainly going to have a massive effect on the industry. But to me, the innovation and the growth in the industrial market is what makes kind of our little corner, I say corner, it's 50% of the industry, what makes our part of the industry so exciting to be part of. And I think there's a very long future in it. So if anyone's coming into this in the industry is a fresh graduate or something like that, I don't think there's any danger of our entire industry disappearing anytime soon.
Okay. We have another 2 minutes left. If anyone wants to reach out to Rafe directly, Rafe, do you have a contact info? Can you share that with everyone?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't put a contact slide in, which I probably should have. So email is rafe@lubrication.expert. So that's a pretty easy one to remember. So if anyone wants to get in touch, Rafe is RAFE, just like safe with an R instead of an S. So yeah, feel free to get in touch if you've got any other questions.
Excellent. I don't think we have any other questions. So, oh, hold on. We got one more. Jochen Windsor. What are your thoughts on automation phase the industry is going through and how it affects the workforce? Good question.
Ooh, good question. Really good question. So I think to me, automation is actually part of the golden generation retiring. So I think the way that we kind of look at it is that the golden generation is pretty big, right? And as they start to retire, realistically, we just don't have the people to replace them. So at some point, some level of automation is going to have to help substitute for their skill sets. And it's not a perfect substitute, but I think basically what it enables, a little bit like AI, it enables like one person like me to do more. So with AI tools and with automation tools, whether they be software or mechanical, It's basically about getting more leverage and being able to do more with less. So that's kind of how I see it. I think it's more of an enabler than anything else.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That is our time for today. Rafe, excellent presentation. Everyone wants to reach out to you, they can directly. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.